All right, this is the second video for Friday's lecture. This is now we are going to talk about how the laws of inheritance that we talked about in the previous lecture that apply to individuals, right? Going from one set of parents to their offsprings. Now we are going to talk about how that affects the population itself. So essentially, we will talk about how population genetics comes into effect and how that affects evolution. The motivating question for this is why do recessive phenotypes persist? Remember, in an earlier lecture, we said that brown eyes are dominant over blue. So why doesn't everyone have brown eyes eventually? If brown eyes are going to be dominant, eventually blue eyes should just go extinct, right? Why doesn't that happen? Also, homozygous recessive is what causes cystic fibrosis. That's a disease, right? So why isn't cystic fibrosis extinct? After all, anything, if you do not have both of those both of those genes for cystic fibrosis, you would not get that. So eventually, shouldn't that go extinct? That is actually a question that was asked to a lot of geneticists back in the day, including a lot of people really. But they were not answered very well, and that was one of the reasons people did not believe in genetics for the longest time. This was asked of Punnett. You remember Punnett Square? So that guy was asked this question at a conference, and he had no idea how to answer that. So eventually he was just, talking with somebody, this guy, G.H. Hardy, he's a British mathematician on the left. He was friends with this mathematician. So they were just, they were playing, I don't know, something like tennis or something like that, or maybe cricket, because this is Britain, right? So they were playing, and afterwards they were just having tea or coffee or something like that. He asked this question to G.H. Hardy. He was just, talking. So G.H. Hardy just sat down there and had the napkin, and he just wrote down an equation, and he just showed this is how it happens, and he just solved that problem in a napkin paper within like 5 minutes of just learning about genetics. He did not know anything about genetics until that point. So he was asked to submit that paper and publish it, and he did that. Then another scientist by the name of Wilhelm Weinberg also published the same thing around the same time, but his paper was actually even better. Better in the sense that it exposed uh, those ideas in a much more coherent fashion. It was more developed. It was better, but um, it was not as famous. It did not get as famous. It was not recognized as much. Why? Because he published it in German instead of English. So clearly, what you publish, the language that you publish in, and the language that you speak affects how successful you are. So there is a lot of privilege that is associated with where you are born, what you speak, what kind of things you do, right? That's just something that I wanted to mention. Something else, so initially it was just called Hardy's law. Now it is called Hardy-Weinberg principle. But there was another American scientist who also published about this, like some 30 years before this or something like that. But his paper is also not recognized. All of these were independent works done by independent people. Now let's talk about this a little bit about how this problem can be solved. Let's look at a toy example. Let's think of, again, another trait that is really not a genetic trait, but we'll just give this as an example. A trait called vegetarianism, whether you are a vegetarian or not. Suppose this trait is determined by the gene big V. Okay, so you have two alleles, just a simple case. Dominant allele called big V for carnivore, and recessive allele called little v for vegetarian. Okay, now imagine a population, and so big V and big V little v will be carnivores because uh, vegetarianism, or big V is the dominant allele, and little v is the only thing that will be vegetarian. So suppose there are 6 individuals in an island, and those are big V, big V, big V, big V, big V, big V, little v, two of them, and little v, little v. What are the genotypes here? What genotypes do we have? Well, big V, big V, big V, little v, and little v, little v. Those are the genotypes. What are the phenotypes? Carnivores versus vegetarians. So how many of these are carnivores? 5 of them. I have designated those with those squares, red squares, red for blood. That's how I came up with that. But you could also have vegetarians, which would be this green circle with little v, little v. Okay, so we have a population like that. Now the question is, how many vegetarians are there going to be in the next generation? Can we know? What can you tell me about it? Well, not much really, because it depends on a lot of factors, including how many offspring they are going to have. So we cannot really tell how many vegetarians they are going to have in the next generation. But what we can do is tell what proportion of these individuals are going to be vegetarians in the next generation. Okay, let's think about this. Again, the population itself I'm showing on the top right. Okay, we have five carnivores and one vegetarian. The gene pool, we just need to come up with some terms to characterize this, to help us with this. Okay, so the gene pool is the total number of all the copies of all the genes in a population. Okay, total number of all the genes in a population. So what is the gene pool here? How many genes do we have in this gene pool? Think about it. 12. Why? Because we have 12 of those letters. Each letter corresponds to 12 genes. Really, this should be called allele pool, I guess, but we are going to just talk about it like this is how it is defined. Okay, so we have 12 genes in the gene pool. Another term we need to know is allele frequency, which is the relative abundance of the different alleles in the gene pool. Relative abundance, that being the key term. Okay, relative abundance of different alleles. What are the two alleles? Big V and little v. So what is the frequency of dominant allele big V? It is the number of big V in the population divided by the number of total alleles in the population. That comes out to be how many big V's are there in that population there on the top right. 8 big V's. So 8 divided by what's the total? 12. That comes about to be 2/3. So 0.67 more or less. What is the recessive allele frequency? So frequency of little v. If you do the same process, you will find that it is 0.33. Now hold on to your hats because this is going to blow your mind. If you add those two, you are going to get 1. This is not, I was just joking when I said you should be surprised by this. This is not surprising, right? If you add those two, you will get 1. The dominant allele frequency is designated by little p, and the recessive allele frequency is designated by little q in general. Okay, so obviously p plus q equals 1. Let's talk about one more term. I promise this is the final term before we can answer this question. So this last term is genotype frequency, which is a fraction of individuals in the gene pool possessing each genotype. Now we are talking about genotypes. Okay, how many genotypes are there and what is the proportion of those genotypes in the population? Well, there are 3 genotypes: homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive. Let's talk about each one in turn. So the first one, for homozygous dominant, how many individuals are there? 3 of those, and the total is 6. So divide 3 by 6 and you get 0.5. So that means that there are essentially 50% of those individuals are homozygous dominant. What about heterozygous frequency? 2 of those individuals divided by 6, so that is 0.33. And the last one is 1 divided by 6 because we only have 1 homozygous recessive, which is, remember, that's the vegetarian individual. Now, one more time, if you add those 3 up, this also adds up to 1. Okay, 0.5 plus 0.33 plus 0.17 adds up to 1. So both the genotype frequency and the allele frequency equal to 1. That is the key factor here. Okay, so P is 0.67, Q is 0.33. So what is the genotype frequency going to be in the next generation? Remember, that's the question we are trying to answer. We don't know what it is going to be 50 years from now, but let's take it one step at a time. We'll do next generation, and then generation after that, and then generation after that. So suppose there is no, these people do not really care and they do random mating, okay? It doesn't matter whether you are vegetarian or carnivore, you will marry this other person and you will have kids with them. If you have random mating, then essentially the female will get big V, little v, and the sperm can also have big V, little v, right? Suppose that's the case. Now, uh, if we add the frequencies there for big V, that's the frequency, it's P equals 0.67. For V, it is 0.33, and the same thing up at the top. So what can you do? If you multiply this 0. I cannot write this here, 0.67 and that 0.67, we multiply those, what do we get? We get 0.45. Now we do the same thing here. So we multiply this P and Q. Essentially, this is P times Q. That's what we are trying to see, P times Q. That comes out to be 0.67 times 0.33, that is 0.22. The one at the bottom is also P times Q, so that is going to be 0.22 also. And the last one is Q times Q, so that is going to be 0.11. All right, so let's look at what the genotype frequency is for the next generation. Genotype frequency for big V is this box right here. That is 0.45. Big V, little v, there are two of them, right? Big V, little v, so that's one, and that's another one. So you add both of those, and you get 0.22 plus 0.22, that becomes 0.44. And for the little v, it comes out to be 0.11. Okay. Now, if you add all of those up, you will once again get 1. Why? Because this is essentially p square, right? This is p square, this is pq, and this is q square. So we are essentially just adding all of those up. And if we add all of those up, we get a 1. It makes sense because p square plus 2pq, because we have 2 pq's, and q square equals 1. This is just like saying from basic algebra, if we squared p plus q, I'm struggling with writing this here. I don't have my pen with me today. P plus q whole square is essentially p squared plus 2pq plus q square, and that also equals to 1. So 1 square equals 1. So that's essentially the idea here. So offspring generation 1 will have this, right? That's what we just talked about. What about offspring generation 2? If you keep multiplying, just do this now, okay? If you do this again, you will get the same values. V times V, big V gets 0.45, big V gets 0.44, little v gets 0.11. What about generation 3? Same thing. And you keep doing that, and that keeps on happening. So that is something that stays constant. Over generations, the genotype frequency does not really change. This formula, p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1, that is now called Hardy-Weinberg equation. What this is really saying is, in a population, allele and genotype frequencies will remain constant. They will be the same, 0.45 in our case, 0.45, 0.44, and 0.11. That will remain constant over generations in absence of other evolutionary influences. That last part is important, where we say in absence of other evolutionary influences. What does that mean? What cannot happen? Those are the assumptions we are making, right? What are those evolutionary influences? Let's talk about those. Those are no mutations. In this case, for example, you might have noticed we did not assume that there was going to be any change. There's not going to be any addition or deletion of any of those genes. No migration, meaning there are no individuals coming in or going out from this population. No selective mating, meaning vegetarians versus carnivores, they do not really care about who they are going to marry. There is no selective mating. No differences in reproduction rates among genotypes, meaning vegetarians and carnivores, all the genotypes really, they have similar reproduction rates. It's not very different. And we also assume that the population is infinite, because if the population is not infinite, then things change quite a bit. Of course, we used a toy example with only 6 individuals, just because we would not want to go through 600,000 individuals and write out the formula for all of those right now, right? But this is just a toy example. But those are the assumptions we are making. If those assumptions are held, then our this formula, that Hardy-Weinberg principle, will hold. But what happens if those assumptions are not met? Well, let's look at this. Let's see if you understand the Hardy-Weinberg principle first. Suppose homozygous recessive gene r causes rudeness. Again, this is just a toy example, okay? I'm not saying that this is actually what happens. Suppose this rudeness trait is caused by homozygous recessive. So what is the genotype frequency of heterozygotes if 4 out of 100 people are rude? Okay, this is what we know. We know that 4 out of 100 people are rude. Now we can calculate all the genotype frequencies. Okay, let's see how that actually works. So what do we know? We know that 4 people are rude, and rude is caused by r, right? And it's a genotype frequency. So rude means r, little r. So q square equals 4 out of 100, so 0.04, right? If q square equals 0.04, then we know that q must be 0.2. You just take the square root of 0.04. Okay. If you do that, now you know q. You also know that p plus q equals 1. So obviously you can calculate what p is. What is p? P is just 1 minus 0.2. So p is 0.8. If we know p and q, then we can calculate anything we want. So 2pq is just 2 times 0.2 times 0.8, that comes out with 0.32, and p squared is 0.8 squared equals 0.64. Now to check that it makes sense, you can add 0.64, 0.32, and 0.04. Remember, this we are adding p squared plus 2pq plus q squared. That has to sum up to 1. You can check, it should. So the question was, what is the genotype frequency of heterozygotes? Well, for the heterozygotes, it is that, right? The genotype frequency for heterozygotes is 0.32, meaning 32% of the people will have the heterozygous trait. What happens if you have 3 alleles instead of 2? Well, an example of that is human blood type. Remember, we have three alleles, IA, IB, and IO, or little I is what we used before. So if we have these, then, well, the allele frequencies would be, instead of P and Q, we would get P plus Q, P and Q and R, and you would get P plus Q plus R equals 1. Then you multiply all of those, squaring both sides, and you get p squared plus 2pq plus 2qr plus q squared plus 2qr plus r squared equals 1. That's the formula you get. And now you know what you are doing, right? You can also add one more, p plus q plus r plus s, and you just expand it, and you would get that answer. So pretty simple stuff at this point. So the genotype frequencies are p squared plus 2pq, 2qr, q squared, 2qr, and r squared. Those are the genotype frequencies. So what are the implications of the Hardy-Weinberg principle? Why does it matter? Well, remember, those assumptions that we talked about infinite populations and such, those do not really make sense. So what do? Why is it useful then? Well, even in the absence of those things, it provides what is called a null model, or a baseline or control. It essentially says, well, if none of those things were happening, this is what we would expect. So if anything like this is not happening, if Hardy-Weinberg principle is not met, then some of those assumptions are not met, right? That's what we can conclude. So consider an inherited disease, say Huntington's chorea. Okay, so this can be important. So we want to ask the question: how many people in the next generation will have this disease? That can be pretty important from hospital management perspective, right? How many people in the next generation will have this disease? We cannot really tell how many people, but in general, we can say what proportion of people in the next generation will have this disease. How? Because we say, well, Hardy-Weinberg principle says that the number of the proportion of people with this genotype is going to be the same in future, about the same proportion, right? Not the number, about the same proportion. So the people can decide on how many hospital beds to prepare for people with Huntington's chorea in, say, 25 years, so next generation. Of course, Hardy-Weinberg principle says that the population has to reach equilibrium before the Hardy-Weinberg principle holds. Remember, we started with something with the carnivore example. We started with something like 0.67 and then 0.3 something and 0.11, right? But then the next generation, we had 0.45, 0.44, and 0.11, and then constantly we would get the same one. So it has to reach equilibrium. In the very first part, there is no equilibrium, but as soon as one generation passes, we will reach Hardy-Weinberg principle. Okay, so how long does it take to reach equilibrium? One generation, except for sex-linked loci, which might require multiple generations, but we don't need to worry about that too much at this point here. And so what happens if the assumptions are not met? What happens? Well, what if the amount of meat suddenly becomes low? We are saying that, none of that happens. If the amount of meat suddenly becomes low, then, the carnivores will probably die out, a lot of them, because they do not have enough food to eat. What do you do then? Those numbers and those proportions of different groups have changed. That is what leads to evolution. Okay, and that's what we are going to talk about next. So to summarize, Hardy-Weinberg principle says that in a population, allele and genotype frequencies will remain constant over generations in absence of other evolutionary influences. And what are those other evolutionary influences? Essentially, this says mutation, migration, selective mating, those would be the evolutionary influences. Hardy-Weinberg principle assumes that none of that is happening. Hardy-Weinberg principle provides a null model to compare observations against. If we see something that does not meet Hardy-Weinberg principle, then we can say, oh, one of those assumptions is not met. Which one is it? We can test that. It is actually also something that forms the basis of population genetics, and that is why it is very important to understand. Now let's talk about evolution. Okay. Initially, this one shows Lamarck's theory of evolution. It essentially said that, for example, giraffes had regular normal necks, but as trees got taller and the giraffe had to eat those leaves in those trees, giraffes kept getting longer necks because they were always stretching. Okay, that's what they were saying. That was one of the key ideas. Lamarck also had some really nice ideas, but this is what we tend to focus on, which is really unfortunate and unfair for Lamarck. But that's what people have done. Okay, so the idea here is that animals can will evolution. If we need to have longer neck, we can just stretch, and over generations we will get longer necks. That was the idea there. And I have to prune that out right now. That is not true. Okay, we cannot will a trait into existence. Let's talk about evolution now. Let's look at this group of penguins here. Clearly, there are differences among different individuals. We think of penguins as being, well, penguins, but they are not all the same, right? There are differences here, just like there are differences among humans. I wonder if the penguins look at humans and they think they're all the same. There is no difference. So what can cause genetic variation? Why you have tall people, short people, people with brown eyes, people with blue eyes, people that are bald, people that are not bald, people with curly hair, people that are predisposed to get skinny or fat, people that have genetic disorders and diseases and such. Why do we have genetic variation? What causes that? How did you get your characters? Well, it is from inheritance of genes from your parents. How do you differ from your parents though? Why do you differ from your parents? Well, we talked about a few things: crossing over, so meiosis, mutation, and the environment. How much food you eat, where you are, the things that you do. Now let's talk about mutation a little bit more. So you have a regular DNA on the left hand side, but you get this incoming UV photon, ultraviolet light. Okay, with this ultraviolet light, it might damage the DNA, so some of these linkages might be broken. That essentially changes the DNA. That is mutation, right? This is just a recap. So mutations are random changes in the structure of DNA, and these can cause changes in phenotypes. For example, you might get an extra wing, or some people have like extra thumb, a little bit of it anyway. So those are extra phenotypes. A lot of these mutations are deleterious, meaning they are harmful. That is why we never see them. Somebody gets that mutation, that baby dies immediately, so we would not see that very often. And this is not just about humans, but in general, a lot of those are deleterious, so we would not see them because they die out and they cannot pass that gene to other generations. But sometimes they are not deleterious, meaning they do not kill the animal immediately. So these animals still live long enough to have babies and potentially pass these mutated genes to their new babies. So something that is important is mutation is random. Okay, usefulness of a mutation will depend on the environment. An extra wing may be useful for a bird, but not so much for an elephant, right? Because it is not going to fly anyway. So why do you need a wing, right? So a lot of mutations do not really have benefits. A lot of them do have harmful effects, though. But even the traits that are not useful can be inherited generation after generation. For example, we talked about Huntington's chorea or a lot of other diseases. Let's look at this example with cystic fibrosis. Okay, cystic fibrosis is a genetic disorder caused by a gene with two alleles, big F and little f. So what are the possible combinations? This is a classic Punnett square, and you get big F, two big F little f's, and one little f little f. So the big F little f are the carriers. Okay, they do not have cystic fibrosis, maybe not, because you have to have little f, but they can still carry that little f gene. They would not have the disease, but they can still carry it forward to other generations. So this disease exists even at some point because someone had a mutation at some point in the past that caused cystic fibrosis. A person with this disease does not necessarily die before reproducing. Average lifespan is 44 years, so they can have babies and they can carry that gene forward. So if this is caused by homozygous recessive, which it is, there are still carriers. Okay, so they will not have the disease, but they can carry it forward. This shows that evolution is random. Even bad traits can persist because of this reason. If something happened and the roof fell on top of a lot of people, just by randomness, there will be some individuals that will live. That randomness is what causes evolution in many senses. So if the environment and mutation match, then the organism is more likely to survive better, also to produce more offspring. In general, in biology, we call that have better fitness. Okay, so they will have better fitness if the environment and the mutation match. So different phenotypes can have different survival and reproduction rates based on their environment. This is the idea called natural selection. Depending on the environment, you will be more successful or less successful. I probably will not be very successful in, you know, in an MMA ring, or is that a ring? Octagon maybe? I would not be very successful there. Why? Because my phenotype does not allow me to succeed there. I'm more successful here. Some of you might be more successful out there in the basketball court, or maybe, somewhere. But it depends on the environment and what your genotype allows you, right? What your phenotype is. If you are tall, you are probably going to be successful in, you may be successful in basketball or volleyball or something. If you are not, then not a lot of people, a lot of short people are successful as basketball players. There are some, but not a lot. And this idea that nature really selects for certain individuals that are more suited for that environment is called natural selection, and this is the key mechanism of evolution. Okay, how does natural selection differ from some other type of selection? Artificial selection is what comes to mind. A lot of you are in the agriculture department, and you must know that we create a lot of new breeds of species by artificially selecting for them. We say, all right, this is a really tall, really nice fat chicken, so we will breed this forward because everybody wants a fat chicken instead of lame, skinny chicken. That is actually how we got all these, really fat chickens now. If people from early 1900s, so 100 years ago, saw the chicken now, they would be like, what? How did we get chicken like that? That cannot be chicken. Okay, so they were artificially propagated. There was actually a competition where they said, well, let's see who has the best chicken. And everybody brought the chicken, and somebody brought a really nice fat chicken, and they thought, oh, that's what we want in future. So they bred that animal more and more and more, and now we have more fat chicken instead of those skinny chicken that used to be the norm back in the day. Also, one of the drawbacks is that these new fat artificially bred chicken that we eat do not taste as the same as before. So there is a drawback, right? You get a fat chicken, a lot of meat, but not a lot of flavor, maybe. So that's the drawback there. So natural selection, again, going back to natural selection, that's the key mechanism of evolution. Evolution, again, is the gradual change in heritable traits of a population over generations. Gradual being the key term. Remember, in the early part of the semester, we talked about how organisms appeared over the last 3.5 or 4 billion years. The key is time. A lot of people think, how can we get something so complex? Again, the key is time. I may not be very good at playing poker, but if I improved even like 0.00001% every day for 1,000 years, I could get really good at it, much better than anybody else has ever been, right? So it's a slow process, but if given time, it can make a big difference. So artificial selection is of course intentional, natural selection is not. That is why we can end up with something that is completely, it may not really be beneficial, but it just happens because it is not intentional. So you might end up with a bigger wild pig if being big was advantageous, but there's no design or purpose to it. It just happened. First, because of some mutation, you got a bigger wild pig, and because being bigger was better for that particular environment, that pig will produce more offspring, and they will produce more offspring, and all of a sudden we are going to get more big wild fat pigs. This idea of natural selection has a long history, but as we know it now, it came from Charles Darwin, who came up with this theory called the survival of the fittest. Here's a quote from Charles Darwin, it says, it is not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change. That's the key. Most adaptable to change. If you cannot adapt to changes, then you are not going to succeed. Okay, if I taught you the same way I was teaching 3 years ago, I probably would not be very successful, because maybe my method from back in the day was not working and the environment had changed. The students now are not the same as they were before, right? So as time had changed, I have to change also. Same thing here. It is the species that is most adaptable to change that will be most successful. And that is actually one of the reasons humans have been so successful everywhere. We have lived in a lot of places, right? From the coldest of the places to the hottest of the places. We have made a huge amount of changes in the ocean, in the air. We have been to the moon. Why are we so successful? It is because we are by far the most adaptable to change. As change happens, we can adapt to it. In particular, we have the tools, right? We can use technology to help us adapt. A lot of other organisms cannot do that. They are more flexible in terms of, they may be able to tolerate more higher temperatures or colder temperatures. They might be able to move faster. They might even be smarter, but they do not have the tools. Okay, so everything worked out well, and that is why we are the most successful. But if we stay as is, then we are not going to be most successful, because time will essentially create something else that is going to be a little bit more different and a little bit more successful. Again, one idea is natural selection, which is the mechanism of evolution. And this essentially ensures that only the traits that help a species survive or reproduce can get passed to future generations, unless there are some straggler traits that do not really matter and they just sort of like hitch a ride in a sense, right? They are just there by chance. So what is the survival of the fittest? Survival of the fittest is where you have competition between two individual organisms. Natural selection is where you have the survival of the fittest on a larger scale. So you are thinking of entire populations at this point. And evolution is how those two processes happen over millions of years, depending on how you look at it. Some people might look at thousands of years, some people might look at billions of years. So I'll stop pretty shortly, but let's talk about how we get complex systems. All right, let's look at the eye, for example. An eye is a very complex system, right? But if you look at different species, you might see that there is a general gradual progress in how eyes have developed. In some of the earliest animals, you only have photoreceptors and the nerve fibers. That's it. So they can only detect light versus dark. That's it. But over time, there was folding and there were added things. There is the lens, and that is how we essentially got to where we are now, this complex eye. It did not just happen. Okay, it did not just happen. It was not designed or anything. It just changed over millions and millions and millions of years. That's how we got where we are. How can evolution give rise to something so complex and beautifully engineered as a human eye, simply by chance? Is it because of God? Okay, let's talk about that shortly. But suppose you start with something that can only detect light and darkness, but then you got something that is a little bit more, a little bit better just by random mutation, and those are a little bit more successful, and the other ones are not so successful. So you get, more offspring that inherit that trait, and you keep on doing that over millions of years, and you get a complex eye. There's a really nice paper, a really nice book by Richard Dawkins called The Blind Watchmaker, which I think might be a good idea. Richard Dawkins is, how do I put it? He's a bit of an a-hole. Okay, he really is. But he has some really nice ideas. Okay, and this particular idea I kind of like. Okay, so here's the idea. Suppose you have how do you get a complex thing like a watch, right? Can you get a watch if somebody does not design it? That's the idea. Okay, somebody has to design it, otherwise how do you get a watch? A watch means there must be a watchmaker. A beautiful organism means that there must be a creator. Okay, but suppose you have a box with all the little pieces for the watch. Okay, all the little pieces are there, but they are not arranged in a fashion. So it is not a working clock, but everything is in there. Okay, now you shake it a little bit. You shake it once. Is it going to make a watch? Everything is there. Is it going to make a watch? Of course not. You shake it some more. Is it going to make a watch? No. Do it again? No. Do it again? No. But if you keep doing it for a million years, do you think it could make a watch? Maybe. What about a billion years? Yeah, you may not think that it is still not going to make it, but a billion years is a long time. Imagine doing that for even 6 months. Think of doing that for 6 months. In a billion years, you could get a working watch. There is no creator, nobody designed it, but it just happened because of time and randomness. In fact, you could get multiple ways of organizing those things that would still result in a watch. Maybe some of those things will, instead of resulting in a watch, it will result in, I don't know, a phone, or a wheel, or a car, a miniature car, or a toy, something like that. It could result in a lot of different things. It is because of time. Okay. So I don't know why the text got cut off there, but that's okay. The slides that I will post online will have that. I'll just end here. I'll just say, does this mean that there is no God? Is that what I'm saying? Does evolution mean that there is no God? Really, not really. I'm not saying that there is no God. Your belief is a separate thing from science. The only difference is science provides evidence. Religion oftentimes does not really provide evidence that can be tested, right? That's the difference. All evolution does it provides a different mechanism that could also work. Maybe God works through the mechanism of evolution. We probably will not ever know. Maybe this is what God intended. We cannot know. But keep an open mind, and you might find that evolution actually might be something that might lead to what we have today. Okay, it's just an alternative hypothesis, a really nice alternative hypothesis, though, that probably is true from the perspective of the science. You don't need to jettison religion. That's not what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to keep an open eye, and at least for the purposes of this class, understand what evolution is. Interestingly, a lot of people more and more are saying that evolution might be the mechanism how we got this. So the perspective on evolution has seen a continuous, uh, uh, people have believed in it a little bit more every year. So I think that's a good idea, though. All right. Okay, I'll leave you here, and I will see you in class on Monday. All right, bye.